Okay, I am post heat treat now. So all I've done is I've put this on the flat platen and I've surface ground it just a little bit more just to get the thickness uniform from end to end, and it is about 107 thousandths. This one is 105 thousandths. So now what I've done is the first thing I did was I took and ground the edges of the knife where I'm going to scribe. Well, I'm not going to do a tang tape around this one, but here and here I've just taken that to a 220 finish, and the reason for that is I want a good contrasting scribe line to show up long after this bluing is worn off. And I've done the same here, but I've also done this surface down here since we're going to be tapering this tang. So now I'm just going to do a little bit of layout on this knife particularly before I put them over on the surface plate. So I put the guard back on, and I'm going to scribe some pretty important lines, and I'm going to use a carbide scriber, but this line here that I'm scribing, this is going to show me where my tang taper begins, and of course it's going to extend down to the butt of the knife. So I'm going to scribe this pretty deeply on both sides, and again I want this scribe line to be visible after this bluing is worn off from dunks in the dunk tank and everything else. Now the second line I want to scribe is going to show me where my plunge cut starts. So back when I designed this knife, I incorporated a 1/4 inch of free area above the guard that's going to remain flat and parallel. So I just take this high-speed steel tool bit, has become my parallel of sorts. I just lay that there on top of the guard, and then I scribe another line, not quite as deep, because all this is going to do is show me where to set my grinding jig to start my plunge cut. So I do this on both sides. And I get it kind of deep down here, and then I just let it kind of fade to nothing up at the top of the knife, since the grind's just going to come up here, and I don't want this scribe mark to be visible when everything is finished. So I'm ready to take the guard off of this, and then we'll lay these over on the surface plate, and we're going to scribe to define where our plunge cut goes. That's going to form our cutting edge. We'll scribe back here for a center line just so we can eyeball as we grind to make sure we're not creeping over in any direction. We want to stay centered and we want to stay symmetrical. And then of course we'll scribe a couple lines here to define our tang taper. This knife is ready for the surface plate now because we're just going to scribe the grind lines and then a center line back here. And that keeps everything straight. So I'm going to knock these pins out. Tight holes on these pins, but that's exactly what we wanted. So now I'm just going to pin them back together just to keep these things from getting separated and getting misplaced. Okay, we're getting ready to lay out the cutting edge. So I've set the height gauge to leave me 25 thousandths between my twin lines, because both of these knives pull down to a pretty fine grind before we taper in at 20 degrees for the cutting edge itself. So just pushing down firmly, and this is a carbide scriber on this height gauge. Just like that. We're going to roll the knife. So we're just going to do this on both of them, and this will give us twin lines. Let's see if I can show them to you. They're hard to see with the camera. And I don't know if you can see those or not, guys, but they're there. So everything on the outside of those lines gets ground away. And so now we're going to reset the height gauge. Let me scribe this knife, and then we're going to reset the height gauge to do our center line and our tang taper. And for the tang taper, I like to reduce the thickness between here and here Oh, by about only by about a third, just to come down a third less thick than it is here. Nothing big on that, but it adds a nice little stylish touch to the knife, I think. And then we'll set the height gauge again to do a center line right here to keep us straight. I thought I'd take a second before I started grinding to explain for Craig and Rand exactly why we put these blades on a surface plate, and using the trueness of the surface plate, we established these grinding lines. And with this discoloration on the blade, now is a good time to point out the importance of that. Now, I ground these flat on my platen over there after we got them out of heat treatment, and my platen is made of porcelain, and it is really nice and true. And I check it periodically with a straight edge, a parallel, or a steel rule, just to make sure we're not wearing in any one spot. But the porcelain platens wear forever. I'm working on 9 years on that first platen. But these would indicate low spots where you still see the heat treatment discoloration. And of course where it's shiny, well, those are the high spots. Now if you took a dial indicator and put this on the surface plate and started measuring, you would probably see less than 1/10 of a thousandth of difference between this high spot and this low spot. So it's pretty darn flat. But it's good shop practice to take your benchmark for flatness, which for me is my surface plate. And in any machine shop, it is the surface plate that is kind of the king of the job in that. And using the surface plate, you then transfer that flatness to your steel. At that point, it really doesn't matter what your steel does. You're grinding to these lines, so your blade's going to be straight. And that's why we do that. But I just thought I would outline that now. Those of you who have watched my videos in the past, you've heard me explain all that before, but for somebody who hasn't, that's why we go to what would seem like overkill precision to establish flat grinding references, but it's important. Now there are those that would say, well, you can simply take a dial calipers and using the outside edge of your knife, you could determine where you want your lines to be and just use the edge and scribe that way. Well, the only problem with that is if your steel is not true to start with, you'll get parallel lines, sure, but they're not necessarily going to be straight lines. That's why we use the surface plate. Now, if you do this sort of thing pre-heat treatment and you have just relied on the outside edges of your steel to guide, and if you have ground a little curve to your blade that you might not be able to catch, you're going to catch it when you heat treat, because that curve is going to turn into a warp, especially when you oil quench. So, yeah, use your flat reference, which is the surface plate in any machine shop, and you just rely on what you know to be true, and save yourself some headaches. So, yeah, that's why we don't use a dial calipers and just rely on what the steel mill gives us for flatness. Pretty simple. Alright, so we are set up here in the vise, and I've got this is just a grinding jig, filing jig. It has many uses in the shop, and it's hardened 01 1/4 inch stock that I didn't draw out very much, so it has remained hard, so it will resist the grinding belts, and it keeps me true when I start these plunge cuts. So all I'm doing is that forward scribe line that I made, I'm pulling that down till it is just even with the edge of that grinding guide, and then I can tighten them up. And I learned a long time ago when I was grinding to use something like this, because if you're trying to do it freehand, yeah, with experience you can get it right most of the time. It's those few times that you don't, and you're going to end up creeping back to try to get those plunge cuts even on each side, and you can creep back until you're almost on top of your guard, and it doesn't look good. So I don't like to do this kind of work more than once. So yeah, it's taught me, use jigs and fixtures. there's nothing wrong with relying on them, especially when you're trying to get this stuff done in one shot. So we're tightening these up really well. So I'm going to wrap this video up at this point, and when I come back is when we're going to be doing some grinding and then some finish sanding. But it's set up right there to go ahead and do our plunge cuts. And this, again, just helps me get a good job every time. And the grinding is going to be happening pretty quickly because we're going to be using a very aggressive ceramic 30 grit belt to hog off most of the steel. Then we'll step up to an 80, and we'll probably finish with a 320 before we go to hand sanding. And then it's just going to be back and forth between the grinder and the rotary vise, just getting this blade nice and true before we start working on the tang taper. You can do them in either order. You can taper the tang first and then do this. Doesn't really matter. But I'm going to go ahead and grind these bevels first. So there we go. One step closer to completion. And I realize I'm getting much more detailed in this series than I thought I would. And, you know, it kind of happens in every video series I do. But I want Craig and Rand to have a good documentation of the building of their knife and everything that goes into it, because they're kind enough to patronize me with some money, and it's just a nice thing to do, I think. So anyway, guys, see you in the next video, and we're going to be removing some steel and making some sparks.